We in this section where we introduce errors and power to focus on questions. What questions would we be asking for confidence intervals and hypothesis tests, right? And so here are some thoughts for us, right, as we explore information from a given data set and try to come up with questions, right, that would be used where we would need a confidence interval to answer the question or hypothesis test. And so it becomes practice, right, or exposure as you see more examples. So let's challenge ourselves now to come up with some questions. So imagine you have a variable from some data set. Remember, we collect data or someone collects data. And what we want to do in our questions, we want to make sure that in the question, right, it states or implies the population and the parameter of interest, and that it can be answered with that method. So for example, math SAT score, that's a quantitative variable. Okay, someone's scores range from 400 to 1600, right? In terms of SAT, what would a question for confidence interval and hypothesis test look like, right? And so thinking about it, we would need a confidence interval is going to measure, right, a certain value, and then hypothesis test is going to check to see if the value from the population is greater than, equal to, or different than, right? So this is an estimate, right? And so when we think about the values, there's an estimate for a confidence interval, and then for a hypothesis test is something true, higher, lower, etc. So there are an infinite amount of questions probably we can ask about this. I have some on the side over here. Let's look at the one in white here. So in this case, what is the mean math SAT score for students in 2019? That's it. That would be a confidence interval question. For hypothesis tests, is the mean math SAT score for students in 2019 more than 590? Again, I just came with this number. I'm asking questions. There's others. We can say, is the mean SAT score less than 590, right? There's an infinite amount of questions, but I want to make sure you can see two examples. I would challenge you to come up with your own. Let's look at another variable. Qualitative or categorical variable, right, are your grades. SAC Math 219 students in fall, their grades. Confidence interval is an estimate. Hypothesis tests, you're going to test something, right, that its value is true or higher or lower. Okay, here's my examples here. Hopefully you can read it in red here. What proportion of SAC Math 219 students, right, the population, the parameter, for fall 2019 received a C or better? That would be, I want an estimate, right? We have a sample and we want to estimate the population. Hypothesis test question, what was the proportion of SAC Math 19 students for fall 2019 who passed the class? Was it less than 50%? Right, as we do that, you could think of what the null, and think about these, what the null and alternative would be in each of these cases for the hypothesis test, right? And then you could say, oh yeah, I think I have an idea. This is an appropriate question for a hypothesis test. Let's take a look at one more here. Here we have two variables, a categorical and a quantitative. So what kind of confidence interval do we write? Keep in mind that you want to choose, right, two of the categories to compare. So notice in the categorical, we have first generation status, and then your GPA is quantitative. So what would those look like? What is the difference in GPAs between first gen and non-first gen students, right? We're going to compare the GPAs and what's the difference between them. That would be a confidence. I want to estimate the difference. It's a quantitative value. For a hypothesis test question, do non-first gen students have a higher GPA than first gen students, right? We're comparing them together, which comes back to we're comparing, is it higher or lower? This would be a hypothesis test. This would be a confidence interval, right? We're finding a value. Remember, a confidence interval is an estimate. And then we have one more example. This time we have two categorical variables. It's a little bit more challenging to come up with a question, a confidence interval question, You're going to choose one of the categories. So I'm going to look at coffee, right? Coffee drinkers and non-coffee drinkers. And then choose success from one or the other. So I'm going to compare, I'm choosing late night. Okay, so how would I compare them? Well, what is the percent difference between coffee and non-coffee drinkers who say they are most productive during the late night? So we're going to compare those two groups. And then for the hypothesis test, is the proportion of coffee drinkers who say they are more productive late night greater than the proportion of non-coffee drinkers who say they are productive late night? And so again, these are just one example of the type of questions you would ask under those cases. We're starting to get a sense of this is how we conduct statistics in the world and how we start to write questions. And that's it.